Hello class, welcome to Photoshop week 3. So, hopefully by now you guys have colored your work and you have your frames, you have your ink layers, and within that you have your different effects and shadows, and then your different color flats. In my example, I have this extra panel that I put in a special mask. It's got this kind of rough edge, and that's why it's separate. So that's going to add a little more complications to what I do, because I've got one of my panels as a separate element. But if you've got it all together, it just makes it a little bit easier, but it'll be a lot of the same steps I'm going to go through. So again, I'm working on the assumption that you guys have a completed Photoshop file, and we're just going to look at a few things to sort of prep this to go out to press. So we're going to start by building a CMYK file, and then the next video we'll look at doing a spot color, and maybe we'll talk about some bonus content after that. So what I'm going to do right now is, before I do anything else, I'm just going to go to my edit menu, and I'm going to just check my color settings. So I would recommend, for what we're doing today, that you set your color setting working space in the Adobe RGB 1998. So there's a big list here. You should find Adobe RGB. And then for CMYK, I'm going to use Coded Grackle. This is a good profile. I will warn you that this is for coated paper. So if you were going to do a project on uncoated paper, you'd want to look at a different color space, but this is a good one for colored paper. Or sorry, coated paper. So the other thing I'm going to do is, in my color management, I'm going to convert to working for all three, both RGB, CMYK, and grayscale. So convert to working means that if I import any graphics, or if I import or open any files, it's going to convert them to those existing working spaces. So that means that any future images or smart objects or files that I open will take on these properties, which should make my color output a little easier. And then this is a new feature in the new update. You may not have this if you have an older version of Photoshop, but they have this desaturate monitor colors. And I find this is good for giving a more realistic idea of what is going to come out of the printer, because often printing tends to be more desaturated. So this will sort of mute your colors a little bit and give you a more realistic idea of what it's going to look like. Right now I'm going to also blend text colors using gamma. I'll leave that at its default position. I've got to do some more research, but I think this should actually give the text a nice look. So I'm just going to say okay, and nothing's really changed in my work. There might be a little bit of a color shift in your screen, but basically this is to hopefully get us set up in an environment that's ready for switching to print color. Now currently my document, just so we're clear, is still in RGB mode, and for reference again, if you missed it, the color spaces, that's under your edit menu under color settings, and you can do this on InDesign and Illustrator as well. I recommend setting a profile for your applications. Just set the same one for every profile or every application. Okay, so now I want to set this up for print, but one other thing we're going to do is we're going to include lettering. So I gave you guys a lettering file, so this is going to be shared on the Trello board. We have a week 3 folder, and there's some items I've given you. One of the items is this Illustrator file. You guys might remember from a past demonstration that when we have Illustrator lettering, we can embed that as a smart object. So I'm going to open that up in Illustrator, and if if you remember, the lettering was all done in vector, and there's this big invisible rectangle going around the outside edge of the page that'll help control alignment. If we just copied and pasted each element individually, we'd have to manually place them. So this way, I can take all these elements, basically in one selection, I can copy, and then I can go into my Photoshop, and I can paste, and we'll just paste as a smart object. And then my recommendation is don't add it to your library, or that's going to start filling up your Creative Cloud library, your online storage space. So I would make sure that's not checked, and we'll do smart object, okay. And that drops in our smart object, and I'll just push enter. Now, I'm not seeing all the words, but if you look in the layers, it's sandwiched in between my two panel layers. So if I move it up, I can see that, okay, it is all together here. Now, just going to touch on one thing here, which is if you'll notice, this balloon is going outside of the boundaries. If I wanted this balloon to stay inside of the boundaries, I would want to put it inside of the mask here. So I basically drop it into this group that I set up. However, when I do that, my speech balloon goes missing here. So I probably want to do a little bit of modification. So my sound effect and my speech balloon in this panel structure, right, they're unaffected. But this other panel I set up, it kind of needs its own smart object. So if I wanted to solve this problem, probably the easiest thing to do would just be to paste a second time, because I've already got the smart object copied, and that drops it in, which if I push return, adds that as another smart object. So now that smart object is kind of floating in between the panels, but now I've got that extra balloon that's in there, right? So now I've sort of got two smart objects that are doing the same job. Now, I've got these smart objects in here, and it's probably a good idea to name them so we're clear what we're dealing with. So this is my panel 1. And then inside of my mask here, I've got another one, which I'll call panel 2. I guess panel 2 to 3. Now, if you remember, we can still edit smart objects by double-clicking on them. Now, before I go forward, I'll just say that, you know, for you, if you've got everything in the same border structure, you don't have like a separate panel like I have, you may find that everything just fits into the one mask and you don't have any adjustments needed. But just as a little bit of bonus content, I'll just show you if you do need to sort of separate your speech balloons. Easiest way to do that is if I just double click on the, so I'll start with like my panel 1 smart object here. If you double click on that, that'll take you into the smart object, opens it in Illustrator. And I know that for panel 1, I only need this one panel here. So I can just delete this content, save it, close it, and then it's been deleted from within Photoshop. So now that panel is just there by itself. There's no additional content, so that you don't have those little edges poking out. And, you know, it's in a mask up here, but if you wanted to be, you know, extra safe, you could also edit the smart object here, get rid of that panel border, save and close. And now you've got your two separate panel borders. Okay, so now that I've got the lettering in, I'm going to look at doing some color adjustments. Okay, so right now my channels are in RGB. And you'll notice even my mask shows up as a selectable channel. That's because I have the mask selected. If I were to select frames, I would only have my RGB channels. And what I'm going to do now is go into my image mode and actually, before I do that, before I do change the color mode, I'm going to do one other adjustment here. So what I'm going to do here is, under my color settings, there's this function called Assign Profile. And I'm going to Assign Profile. Now, it just gives me a warning that this might affect my appearance. That's okay. It's going to be fine. I'm going to say okay. And I'm specifically going to assign the Adobe RGB profile to the document. So earlier when we set our color settings, it's temporarily assigning the Adobe profile to whatever's open. What I'm doing now is I'm assigning it permanently to the document. So if I was to export this, pass it over to somebody else to put in InDesign, when they place it, it's still going to have this profile attached to it. Where if I didn't do this, it may still have its old profile. So even though I'm seeing it in Adobe RGB, on my system, it could look different or could be different when it goes out to someone else's system. So I'm just attaching the profile here. I'm assigning the 1998 profile. So that's just assigning my RGB working profile. And if I go to my image mode and switch it to CMYK color, it's going to ask me about merging. Now, we want to preserve our layers. We want to work non-destructively, so I'm going to say don't merge. And I'm also going to say don't rasterize because we want to keep our smart objects integral. And it's going to tell me that I'm about to convert to CMYK using Coded Grackle 2006. So that's that profile we set up ahead of time. So it's now going to convert things to that existing profile. I'll just say OK. And that's now made it CMYK. And again, you might say, well, now that we changed color modes, would we want to change profiles? We could also go in one more time and make sure we've got the correct profile assigned. So if we want to make sure we have a color profile assigned, in this case the Coded Grackle profile, that's just underneath your color settings, just assign profile. Okay, so now that I've set it to CMYK, conceivably this is ready to go to press, and I would say maybe now's a good time to save a copy of your work. So I'm just going to save this. Again, I'm using the newest Photoshop, so it's asking me to differentiate between cloud and computer hard drive. So I'm just going to save on my computer, and I'm going to keep it right now as a PSD, but I am going to just put this as CMYK. So I'll save it to my desktop right now. And again, I can preserve layers and I can embed profile here in my Photoshop settings. So save. Okay. And so there is my document. Now, I would probably save this as a TIFF file for final output. But before I do that, I want to do a little press check because there's one thing I'm really worried about, which is my lettering. I want to make sure that my lettering is going to be process black only. So an easy way to check that is turn off your black. And if you have what I have, which is gray, that means that I actually have lettering that exists on all my channels. So I have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black text. And that's the speech balloon borders as well. So I'm going to want to deal with that. Now, just to be clear, the sound effect here being in CMYK, That's not a big deal because it's got the red fill on it. It's got pretty thick lettering lines. What we're worried about is the lettering in the balloons here. So what I'm going to do is, because of the way this is set up, it's actually going to be a really easy fix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the channels here. Or, well, not the channels, sorry. I'm going to modify the smart object. So I've got a smart object for this panel. If I double click on it, let's check out this speech balloon. And when you select the text, you're going to see that the fill is using percentages of CMYK. Now, we could go in and we could manually change these. So I could adjust this to be 0, 0, 0, 0, and 100, which is process black. So we could just manually type those numbers in. That's going to make the correction. Or, alternately, if we look here at the stroke, we've got registration black, which registration black is basically using 100% of every color. And there's also this shortcut here, which is a shortcut to process black. And that automatically will just set it to 0, 0, 0, 100. So that little button there, that'll always switch that over to process black. And if I save this and close it, that's going to update in my Photoshop file. Just so you guys can see the difference here, I've got my channels up here, and we're going to turn off black. And you can see the difference here. So the panel on the left was just using process black. That's why it's whited out here. Panel on the right, that's using CMYK. So ultimately, if we've done our job right, it's going to blank out like this. Okay? So just to kind of reiterate one more time, I'll do the other smart object here. So I'll just double click on it. And like I said, I'm not worried about the sound effect. I'm worried about this speech balloon here. So I'll just select my text, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using the fill as process black. And then on my balloon itself, I'm going to make sure that my stroke is also using process black. And so if you were following along, you probably use the lettering file I provided, and you'll notice I played a little bit of a trick on you because I had intentionally used registration black colors. So you're going to have to go in and make those changes. But once you change it to process black, you're going to find that now when you check your channels, there's no problems with lettering now. We could look at making changes to the panel borders potentially, but again, I've got these nice thick borders. I'm not as worried about that, right? It's really the lettering that we want to avoid. I'm going to include an example of off-register lettering, and if you look at that sample image, you're going to see what I'm referring to. It just is going to create a bit of a bad look on the lettering. It will make the art look a little bit blurry too, but it's really the lettering that we're most concerned with. Okay, so now that I've got that changed, this is essentially ready for press. So I'm going to save as, and once again, save to my computer. And on my desktop here, I'm just going to switch this over to a TIFF. I find this is just a nice press ready, slightly more compressed file size. Conceivably, if this is my final output and we're not going to make edits, we could disable layers, it is going to flatten it. So this is why if I save a copy as a TIFF, I can eliminate the layers, but we just want to make sure that we're not getting rid of our working file. We want to make sure we have our PSD with layers still. So I'll just save this to the desktop and save. And I always like to use the LZW compression. I don't have any transparency, but if you wanted active transparency, you turn that on here. And again, if we discard layers, That's going to keep our working file. And I'll say OK. And now I have my copy made and it's ready for press. And that's the first video done. We've got our press ready file. Hopefully you're able to follow along.